All right, welcome to Fitness Junk Debunked. Today we are debunking the gender binary with ILT coach Aziza and our guest Hannah. So I just want to introduce these two phenomenal people that I know. Hannah, you are a documentary filmmaker and currently working on a project that's really interesting, and you're steeped in a lot of interesting research. So that's all I'm going to say. Do you want to tell us more about?
Yeah, sure. So I'm very fortunate right now to be working on a project that has allowed me to take a really intense deep dive into the world of the gender binary to better understand what it is and how it functions in our world and in our lives. And it's led me to some really cool things about gender. And I feel like I went into this project already knowing quite a bit, but the more you learn, the less you know. So I have sort of had my mind blown on the daily in and around just the concept of gender and sort of the weight that we place on gender, and trying to unpack it and think about it from so many different perspectives, whether it's a personal perspective in how we move through the world, whether it's a cultural perspective, a medical or a biological perspective, a neurological perspective. There's so many assumptions that we kind of base our entire understanding of the world on, and
Right.
a lot of that is connected to gender. And the better we can understand it, I think the more we can understand ourselves and understand the people around us, and understand that not everything is an either or, and
Right.
not everything even needs to be an either
Right.
or something in between, but there are so many options of how we can live our lives. And I think we know that. Everybody in this room knows that. And I think beyond that, we feel that from an emotional perspective. But I think really having that information, having sort of the grounding understanding, and listening to a lot of the people have been really doing their life's work around gender, and debunking a lot of things that we understand about gender. It's really cool. So
Yeah, well, I think it's super awesome that you have shared this with us. And I've grown from some of our conversations, and I've left conversations with you where I'm just like, oh my God, my brain just exploded, and it just forces you to think in different ways, which I think is what we need to do as human beings. We need to evolve, and we need to find new ways to think and find new ways to connect with each other. So thank you for your time today, and thank you for joining us. And I don't want to forget about Coach Aziz, who's a non-binary fitness coach with ILT. Her pronouns are she and her. And Aziz, thanks for your time. You do good work with us, helping us understand. Also, I learn a ton from Aziza, so thank you for holding my hand patiently, because we get this wrong sometimes, right? So I think we need to just acknowledge that sometimes we mess up, but we're learning and we're supposed to mess up, and it doesn't mean the end of the world. I'm hoping that with this podcast, we can learn more and get curious and start learning ourselves and finding information and learning to think in new ways. So Pride, happy Pride Month.
happy Pride.
Before, before we jump into our discussion of debunking the gender binary, just curious, Hannah, what's your favorite part of Pride, and why is it important? Because I think it's huge important, and I don't understand why people aren't like, yeah, you know what I mean? But like, why is it important to you?
Well, I mean, it's important to me because obviously I'm a big homo, so that's a huge deal. But I think the act of pride is important because the 2S LGBTQIA plus community has been shut out from the world for a long time and has not been allowed to participate in society as themselves for a long time. It's quite a recent thing that people feel they can be out at work, that they can be out to their families.
Right.
And so Pride is, I think, just a celebration of being able to own who you are and celebrate the people in your life for being who they are, and constantly,
so
reaffirming this idea that we're allowed to be who we are.
Yeah, something so simple but so powerful, and so we need it. It's needed.
Yeah.
Ziz, why is Pride important to you, and what do you look forward to this month?
So like Hannah, I'm a massive lesbian.
I love these descriptive.
So that's one of the reasons. But like Hannah said, it is a celebration. It's also a act of resistance, just being who we are out publicly. And that's how Pride started in New York. That's how Pride, as we know it in Toronto, started in Toronto with the bathhouse raids as well. And I think a lot of people forget that aspect, and there's a lot of talk about remembering where Pride came from, and resisting, police brutality mostly, but then also how that stems from our whole culture. That's just one institution within the larger institution of colonialism. And like Hannah said, it's more recent that people are feeling more comfortable to be themselves publicly, but that's also a recent thing of us being scared to be ourselves publicly, because further back that wasn't a thing. And so it wasn't until the boom of colonialism that we really saw that change, with, and we'll come back into this, but with the gender binary, with a whole bunch of different stuff.
Right. Amazing. Well, thank you for sharing that with us and our listeners today. So I'm going to ask some really basic questions. So like, that's my role, is just to be the basic person here, and ask the questions. And I'm going to let Ziz and Hannah basically get into it, because there's a lot of so many juicy bits, so many nuggets. So I'm going to invite you to get comfy, get a notepad if you need to, because you might want to take notes to go back to things you might forget. Because like I said, whenever I have conversations with these amazing human beings, I'm always wanting to know more and wanting to like have the conversation go longer, but I know that they have lives and they don't want to talk to me all the time. But like, so yeah, sit down, listen, grab a pen and paper, and let's get into it. Let's pretend that we have like copyrights so we can have good music. So music. Okay, so Ziz, can you tell me what is the difference between gender and sex?
So this is going to be a super basic definition. So gender is what you feel personally inside, and that's different for everyone, and everyone expresses their gender differently. And then sex is your biology, and that is split into primary sex characteristics and secondary sex characteristics. So this is where my genetics degree comes in handy.
Ooh, bombs already.
Fancy.
She's got one.
Great, let's go.
And so most people think that your primary and secondary sex characteristics are what define your sex within a sex binary, but we have to remember that the sex binary doesn't really exist either. So most people think XX chromosomes automatically means you were born biologically female, and XY means you're born biologically male. But that can change based on how you respond to hormones, how you develop through puberty. So coming back to those primary and secondary characteristics, your primary sex characteristics are present at birth. So those would be your gonads or and your genitalia. And then your secondary are what emerges during puberty. So that could be hair development, that could be breast development. But so that can change. There are intersex people who have testes but have a vagina because they don't respond to testosterone. There are also people who have one sex chromosome up to 5 sex chromosomes. So it's not just always a pair. We can see people going from a single X all the way to 5 X's or 4 X's and a Y chromosome. So there's a spectrum within that as well. But most people just automatically think that each person is going to have 2 sex chromosomes and they're either going to be XX or XY. And that's not the case.
So based on like everything you know from education, experience, reading, interests, where did the gender binary come from then? Because if it doesn't exist, like how did it, like, so this is where I want these two to go off. So Hannah, you can get in there too.
Hannah, go first, because she definitely has a little bit.
This is a question I've been actively trying to answer, where does the binary come from? How did it start? How did we get here to this moment in time, and like Aziza is saying, there are so many different markers that determine what your, quote unquote sex is. And there are so many variations within that don't equal, male or female. They're intersex people are on the sort of spectrum that is intersex. It's about as common as people who have red hair. So the reality is that in most people's life, they probably know people who are intersex, and not everybody who's intersex even necessarily knows that they're intersex. And another sort of myth that exists.
So can I pause right there? What do you mean that maybe you are, but you don't know?
Well, so a lot of, if you have, if you look down and you have one set of genitalia that aligns with whatever you were assigned at birth, that doesn't necessarily mean you're not intersex. There's a lot going on within the body. There's a lot going on within your chromosomes, as Aziza was explaining. So there are different, I don't know what the word is, but there are different ways to be intersex, and it's not all going to be visible from looking at your genitalia. So a lot of people find out that they're intersex later in life. A lot of people find out because they've gone back into their medical history due to an issue, and they find out that, they actually had an operation when they were a child, which was quite common, but is no longer a commonplace, at least in Canada, which is great. But kids who are born with outward presenting intersex genitalia were typically, their parents had to choose. And sometimes it would happen within the first 24 hours of birth. Sometimes it would happen within the first few years of their lives. So people are raised and understanding themselves as a girl or as a boy, and really struggle within the binary, and find out as an adult that actually they had unconsensual operations done when they were quite young. Which is a huge tragedy, and also a very new concept. So colonialism has a lot to do with where the gender binary came from. The gender binary doesn't exist as a persistent structure within all of history. You can go back as early as Mesopotamia and see evidence of people who are either non-binary, third, fourth, fifth genders, or intersex. In ancient Egypt, there are people who are it was long thought that they were eunuchs, which is a castration method, but under sort of new research and new history and new understandings of the world, they're now believed to be people who are not male or not female. And they're also often people who were spiritual leaders within their community. So you see that even present today with the Hijra in India and with the Musha in Mexico. These are non-binary genders that have persisted past colonialism. But our Western colonial world is very hung up on the gender binary. And that was something that was often forced on communities after the British arrived. And I think I was explaining to you, Steph, once that the need for gender binary throughout history really comes into play, even pre-Western colonialism. It comes into play during wars a lot, because our desire to take over land or take over resources from someone else or from another group is often done through numbers and through being able to fight and through having, a massive population. So typically men would go out to fight, and women would be in charge of growing the population as best they can.
Right. So I'm gonna give our listeners and viewers a little moment. Just breathe And if your brain didn't explode with that knowledge bomb, we got a lot more. So colonialism, war, numbers for war. You wanted to have the most numbers so you could take over your neighboring country. And that's why I always thought it was like chivalrous. And I've heard like myths and urban legends about men not being able to see women's dead bodies. But it's just one of those things that we were fed to keep going along with this thing that was created that a lot of people don't fit in. And that's exclusionary. And it's just one of those things that we've held on to. And I'm so fortunate, grateful to be now aware and like learning now, because the way it wasn't welcoming for everybody. And now we're having an opportunity to re-examine and look at it. And like some of the bits of it are gross. They're very gross. But sometimes you have to dig in the dirt to find the good stuff. So thanks so much for sharing what you've learned with me, with us, and with our viewers. So we know that gender is a construct. Well, the binary is a construct. We talked about colonialism. Can we discuss gender fluidity and gender nonconforming? I'll let you decide who wants to take what, who wants to.
I guess I'll field this first. So, yeah, there's a lot of, even sometimes within the trans community, there's this idea that gender is a very static thing,
Right.
construct. And that's not necessarily true for a lot of people too. And it's not just maybe your gender, but also how you express your gender can change throughout your lifetime. And we're starting to step away from that static idea with sexuality, but gender's lagging a little behind that. And so there's also this idea, and I've seen this every once in a while online, that, you know, if you're cis and you're questioning your gender, then you're probably trans. And that's not always true. And I don't think that's even helpful, because I think cis people should question how they express their gender, even their gender altogether, as well. And because it is a social construct, you can pick and choose what parts of that gender you want to express and what parts you don't. And that doesn't mean you're any less of, you know, a woman if you dress more masculine.
Right.
And so I think it's really helpful for everyone to look at their gender and see what's working for them and what isn't, because it really is a journey of self-reflection and self-discovery. And you learn more about yourself that way. So yeah, sometimes gender can be fluid, and sometimes, you know, some people have the same gender their whole life, but there still can be fluidity in that, like I said, with how you express it throughout your life. And as for gender nonconforming, that is, so we have these ideas of what is the norm and the ideal for usually gender binaries, but there's also a little bit of that seeping into non-binary identities as well. So how femininity is aligned with being a woman and masculinity is aligned with being a man. And we also see that some people think, you know, you're non-binary, so you have to be androgynous. And that's not the case either. Not everyone is smack dab in the middle. No one owes you masculinity or femininity or androgyny.
Right.
And so there are people who within, let's say just for now, within the gender binary, there are women who are more masculine presenting, there are men who are more feminine presenting. And so they're stepping away from what our society considers the norm for their gender.
Right.
And so that's what gender nonconforming means. And so a lot of these people will also get misgendered because people will think they're not a man or a woman. And then within non-binary genders, I don't really think you can have gender nonconformity because there isn't one way of being non-binary.
Right.
But I also think people can also think that if you step away from your presenting yourself as your assigned gender from birth,
Mm-hmm.
then that can be gender nonconforming as well, even though your gender isn't binary, if that makes sense.
Yeah, to me it
Yeah.
does. It makes sense to me. So you just circling back around to misgendering, because we're all learning a new way and we all have old language. And sometimes when someone is going through discovery and things change, their pronouns will change, how they want to be addressed will change. So what I guess what advice do you have for people about misgendering? Because there's this thing about isms and ists, and like we're immersed in it through language and systems and everything like that. And there's this feeling that if you get it wrong, you're bad. And a lot of people shut down when they get it wrong. It's like, oh, it's like, I'm never going to get this right. And I don't even want to try because I'm so embarrassed because I'm bad. And I hate that there's like a more like that moral is kind of attached to it. It's good or bad. It's like you made a mistake. How do you, if you misgender somebody, what advice do you have to like just keep the conversation going and keep both people comfortable still connecting? I know it's an impossible question because everybody's different, but just suggestions, tips.
General suggestions.
Yeah, very general.
Yeah. So when you misgender someone or use the wrong pronouns, mostly I think people's first reaction is like, oh shit, oh sorry. Mm-hmm. But you don't, and so you can say sorry and then continue, but with the person's true name or true pronouns. Or you can just correct yourself. So if you use someone's wrong pronouns, immediately just use the right ones. Or if you use someone's dead name, immediately use their true name.
Right.
And so that's just super easy. Practicing by yourself. And even when you're with other people, I think sometimes people think, oh, this person's not here, so I don't feel as bad when I misgender them or use the wrong pronouns. And not to say like you have to feel bad, but again, do the same thing. Quickly use the correct pronouns, use the correct name. And then it becomes habit. The more you use it, the more it becomes habit. What not to do is to purposely not put effort in.
Right.
Or purposely misgender them, purposely use the wrong name, purposely use the wrong pronouns. And there are people out there who do that, right? They're like, oh, it's too hard. Well, but it's not, because if there's someone who's like, oh, I'd prefer you to use this nickname for me, you're usually going to automatically be like, okay, I'm going to call this person by their nickname.
Right.
This block that we have, because it's something different that goes against what we've been indoctrinated with.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally.
I've also heard that from a few folks saying that not to say sorry because it centers yourself when you misgender someone, to say, oh, I'm sorry, but to say thank you because it acknowledges the sort of work that someone's putting in to keep you being your best self when talking to them. So I find that's a good general practice too. If you ever misgender someone or refer to someone in a way they don't want to be referred to just say thank you and move on.
Right. And again, I'm just here to frame things and be the host, but there's huge benefits in letting somebody be comfortable around you if you care about them. So trying, it might be difficult, but it's worth it. You might get it wrong, but it's worth it because you have, and one of the things I came back to is we're people who need to connect with other people. So by allowing somebody to feel fully themselves, they're going to feel comfortable sharing different perspectives that you might not have considered. And it just deepens your well for learning because you now have a different perspective in your life and somebody who cares enough about you to correct you. And wants to be comfortable around you. So I would usually take that, like I like to thank you as well. And just letting them know you're grateful for that correction and you're grateful for the opportunity to learn and walk this path that we do of life together and be connected. So great tips. There's also some great tips in a blog you wrote last year, Aziza. And the blog was called A More Inclusive and Welcoming Fitness Space, because fitness, I don't like fitness is basically this industry that's like a sociopath that just like wants to hurt you and sell you stuff. And like there are things in fitness that are gendered for no reason. Like I'm sure everybody who's listening or watching this has heard, if you can't do a push-up, you can do a girl push-up. And that like like even before I was learning, that had always bugged me, like that there were things that like movements that were considered less than and then attributed to female, women, soft, weaker. And this is an exciting time in the fitness industry because we're seeing lots of people who are, I guess, presenting female, women, what have you, lifting more than men. So it's like, feminine is not this thing. And Aziza, you and I have had interesting conversations surrounding dance and what we believe to be feminine energy versus masculine energy and how those are presented. We always think that it's soft. And Hannah, I'm going to mention Legendary and really try to stay on topic, but we also, I saw Naomi, who's an incredible, like, can just tear it up at the, like, just is an amazing dancer. And she got really upset because somebody had to, the category was feminine energy, and somebody was really soft. And she's like, what is this soft? Like, why do we think of feminine as soft? Like, feminine energy is can be soft, but it's fierce, it's ferocious. And I guess just having different, broader definitions of what we see it as versus as just like, this is weak, this is strong, man, female. Ripley, people always think that Ripley is the Iron Lion mascot, and she's jacked. She's jacked, and when she sits, she like sits kind of bow-legged because her chest is huge and she's muscular. And anytime people see her, they're like, "You're such a big boy," and it's. But she's not. Muscles make something male or female. Like it's just one of those things that like, where did it come from? Anyway, circling back to Aziza and your blog last year. We talked about evolution of language. So since you wrote that blog last year, things have changed in terms of how you use your language. And I was just wondering, like, if you felt comfortable sharing how your language has changed since writing that blog that was intended to be inclusive and welcoming, and what's changed?
Yeah, for sure. So we're all always on an educational journey. And language will also always change, our understanding of language. And so they're going through that article again. There were a few things that I noticed that I personally don't use anymore, but also there are some words that I've learned a little bit more about. So one of them was I was using trans with an asterisk at the end to mean the trans community. So anyone who's not cisgender. So that could be your non-binary, that could be your trans within the binary, it doesn't really matter. But I was doing a little bit of digging because I'd noticed that people weren't really using the asterisk anymore. And I also don't use the asterisk anymore. And so I was digging into where the asterisk came from. And so what I've gathered is that originally that was used more as an umbrella term just for transgender and transsexual, but we also don't really use the term transsexual anymore. Transsexual were trans people who had had surgery. And at one point that was the only definition. So it didn't matter what kind of surgery it was. You could be transsexual if you're trans and had surgery. Didn't necessarily have to be gender reaffirming surgery.
Just surgery.
Just had a mole removed.
There were some loopholes there. And then later it went to include anyone who's not cisgender. But the asterisk was often applied in trans misogynist ways, which wasn't its intention originally. And that's not always the intention of words, but how they're used can change. And so a lot of people stepped away from using the asterisk and just using trans to mean anyone under that transgender umbrella, whether that's being trans in the binary or being non-binary. So that's the first one, and that shows up a few times in that article. So then the next one was preferred pronouns. So this language is still used sometimes, but was used a lot more last year and a few years ago. And then people started really thinking about the word preferred in front of the word pronoun and the connotations that it can bring. And so now we're stepping away from using preferred pronouns and just saying pronouns, because that in itself is a microaggression, because it makes the pronouns that someone uses seen as a preference, and that's not, it doesn't belong to them to begin with. It's just something you like a nickname, right? It's like, yeah, I like this nickname, but that's not the only thing you can call me. Whereas someone's pronouns, no, there's no other option. This is who I am. This is who you need to call me. Not even I'd like you to call me. You need to call me. Because it's not about human decency anymore. It's seeing me for me.
Right.
So stepping away from preferred pronouns and just using pronouns, because the word preferred in front of it illegitimizes the idea that someone using different pronouns that then what was assigned to them at birth is just flu, I guess, you know?
Flu.
For lack of a better term.
Yes, with the Jamaican. Okay. Just came out. It comes out, eh? It just comes out. The flu. Okay. So,
and then there's
sorry, go ahead.
There's one more. So, I myself use the word queer to describe myself because it encapsulates all of who I am. I'm not just a lesbian, I'm not just non-binary, I'm a non-binary lesbian. And within that, I'm also Black, and that Black experience also plays into my experience in the world within the community as well. But there's been a lot of discussion online, and I will save you guys from reading through a lot of it. Just a short, brief history. So with queer, there are people who still use the term to describe themselves, but it has also been used as a slur. So there are people who don't like having that word used to talk about them, which is fair. So some people are reclaiming it, others no, and that's okay. So we can't label the whole community with that word, because there are people who still see it as a slur and aren't going to reclaim it. I still see it as a slur, but I'm reclaiming it. Just like similar to the N-word, right? There are people who are reclaiming it, people who don't, right? And so there are people who, sure, they'll call themselves that, but don't call someone else who isn't comfortable being called that.
Right.
So stepping away from using that term in the article as well, and using, 2S LGBTQ plus, or any variation of that, because that more fully encapsulates capsule, whatever.
Yeah.
Got it.
Word. Yeah,
You got
we
it.
totally get your meaning.
Words are hard.
Yeah.
The community.
Right.
Well, words are hard, and I feel like language is not evolving at the rate, not even that people are evolving, but I think we are more aware of things. Like even the concept of a non-binary identity was not really that prevalent even 5 years ago. And there are a lot of trans people I've spoken to very recently, because I'm talking so much about the gender binary, who, transitioned 15 years ago and have told me that if they transitioned today, they probably would have been somewhere on the non-binary spectrum. But when they were transitioning, their only option was to jump from one end of the binary to the other, and that there really wasn't much of a discussion of what's in between. And to try to create that space seemed like such an uphill battle when they had this option that felt so good and real. And so now, with the language that they understand now, the words that they have, they can redefine their identity or not, or just know that if they were transitioning 15 years ago, they'd be able to redefine their identity as well. And I think a lot of people who are not trans as well, cis people, trans people, non-binary people, can really feel how language is changing their understanding of themselves. And even for me, like my personal understanding of myself is probably not, I don't think I can capture it in words that could adequately describe that to the people around me, or even to myself. So personally, I find that I have to be really careful with how much weight I put in and on language in terms of understanding people, because it's so, especially English, it's not very good, like it's so limited
Yeah.
in certain things,
Totally. Well, thank you so much. We're going to have to wrap up. Hannah, I know that you're busy and you have a hard time that you have to be out of here. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us and sharing what you've learned with us. I found it extremely helpful, and I hope our community does as well. You've worked on some recent projects that were like in hot dogs. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you can that's
sure.
going on in terms of like where we can see some of your work?
Yeah, there's a film that was the opening night film at Hot Docs this year called Artificial Immortality, which is sort of a look at the ways technology is changing our understanding of life, our understanding of religion, and how technology could potentially change the way we interact through generations over time. So that will be on Crave in the fall sometime. I don't have a real date.
Okay.
And I am just going into production on a new series all about cartoons, which
it's another fun conversation that we have, because if you don't know, I'm a big cartoon nerd. So it was a lot of
for you.
The nerd part, yeah. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll catch you soon. Again, thanks. Aziz, you're going to stick around because we're going to close out with some other stuff going on for the rest of the month.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me. And I do want to share just one sort of tidbit that I've been thinking about through my research and learnings, which is largely influenced by someone named Rebecca Bigler, who's a social psychologist for kids, and really envisioning a future where there is more gender diversity and there is more gender presentation available for all of us, includes a world where we don't define each other on the male, female, boys and girls line. And one thing that they said was that they identify as non-binary politically, that they were born a woman and grew up in the world as a woman, but politically they're non-binary. And I thought that was, it really resonated with me, because there's so many rooms that we walk into, especially like if you were to walk into an elementary school classroom, it's totally acceptable to say good morning, boys and girls. But there are so many other lines that are not acceptable. We're not allowed to walk into a classroom and say, a good morning, fat kids and skinny kids.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning, blacks and Mexicans.
Exactly. That's just not allowed, and it's not okay.
Totally.
And we need to better understand the idea that to say good morning, boys and girls, constantly creates a divide that permeates us from a very, very young age.
Totally.
And as we move into the future, being able to use some neutral language and see everybody on an equal playing field at that very early stage in our lives is a key to making a more diverse and accepting future for all of us and for all of our next generations. Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that. That's a great way to, a great thought to leave us with. You've left us with so many like little juicy bits. So thanks so much for that, Hannah. We appreciate you.
My pleasure. I appreciate you both so much. Thank you for having me on the podcast. I feel honored.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you.
We're honored. We're honored.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm out of here. Bye.
Bye.
Sorry.
Okay, so Hannah left us with some resources basically on how we can learn more and a different perspective on how we can view our language and what we say to people. Did you want to discuss? I have some notes here that I asked, like, what could we give our viewers to start learning? And you mentioned a podcast and a TED Talk. So if maybe you want to give a little synopsis.
So there's I can't recommend this episode enough. Also, just this podcast in general. But Laverne Cox, the trans actress and activist, she has her own podcast. And she has an episode with another trans non-binary person named Alok.
Okay.
And it's called Moving Beyond the Gender Binary. The podcast is called The Laverne Cox Show. And they're both racialized people as well. So they talk about colonialism and its play in perpetrating the gender binary.
Right.
And it's also just so nice to hear two trans people talk about gender.
Right.
Because so often in pop culture and popular media, it's one trans person talking to a cis person, and so a lot of times there's a little bit more dumbing down. They get really deep into it. They talk about spirituality. There's so much information there, and yes, they talk about pronouns, they talk about this kind of stuff, but it's on another level.
Right.
And so I can't recommend this podcast episode enough.
So again, that was the Laverne Cox Show, Moving Beyond the Gender Binary is the episode. And that's like a Z's recommendation. Listen.
A Z's recommendation. I re-listened to it yesterday while I was weeding. And
I don't know why we find that funny. Every time we say it, we both kind of giggle, but I think it's pretty awesome that you're so into gardening.
I'm currently loving gardening.
It's an awesome thing to do.
Yeah, it's very grounding. I'm also trying to, on a side note, I'm also trying to garden a little bit more barefoot so that I get the energy from the ground moving. Well,
I love that.
So, and then the
TED Talk.
Yeah, my second recommendation, I stumbled across this recently, and this is more about sex than gender, and it's by a intersex woman, and her name is Emily Quinn, and it's a TED Talk, and it's called "The Way We Think About Biological Sex Is Wrong." It's a nice, quick little. It's about like it's less than 15 minutes. And if you don't want to listen to it, they also have a transcription so you can read it if you're going to read it faster.
Okay.
And so she talks about her personal experience a little bit. It's a nice, quick little bite-size information session. She does talk about how, as I mentioned before, they're not just XX and XY chromosomes, and how You can respond to hormones differently as well. And yeah, that's her. She is XY, but does not respond to testosterone. So she presents more biologically, in quotation marks for those who aren't watching, female.
Right.
So that's another good little information session to get your foot in the door. And then, as always, Google is free. You might
yes.
and
again.
and some critical thought, because there's going to be information out there that you're like, you got to think about it. And so sometimes you might be like, I don't vibe with this information, and just do more and more digging, have more and more conversations.
Definitely. Well, Ziz, you already know, love you, like cook food. Thank you for your patience and chatting with me and chatting with Hannah and taking care of our members here at Iron Lion Training and making them feel welcome, comfortable, and safe in the space, even though right now it is online. Ziz and I, well, Ziz more so is the classically trained dancer and I'm the dumb dancer, but we like to have little dance fit sessions every month or so, and we haven't because, the pandemic, but we're looking to have a body positive ball too. So we did this last year and everybody loved it. It was a lot of fun. We danced, we were silly. The objective, body positivity, again, do some Google research into that, where it comes from, its origin. But basically what we want during Pride Month is for people to feel comfortable in their skin as best they can. We know it's not going to be perfect. You don't have to love every inch and every wart and that's what's usually shoved down our throat when we hear about body positivity. But to me, body positivity is radical, especially in the fitness space, because fitness wants you to be a certain way, and not a lot of people fit into that or feel safe within that. So we like to dance and have fun and just be in our own skin, wearing whatever you want. If it's little, then you wear a little. If it's a lot, then you wear a lot. If it's a costume, which it might be for me, then it's a costume. But it's an hour just to dance with other people. We're going to try to do this outdoors this year. So that's June 25th. More details to come over the next few weeks. So you won't see it on our website right away. But I just want to start the buzz that we are having a ball. Literally going to have a ball, and we're going to dance and try to shake off some of the Panda Express. And I'm also going to throw to our next podcast, because it's also National Indigenous History Month. And I think it's important to, I know we're asking you to learn a lot, and these our podcast is about learning. It's about evolving, and it's about informing yourself, critically thinking, and forming your own opinion. But if you feel lost and you're just learning and you're shocked by what has been in the news recently, and has gripped our hearts, and it just keeps getting darker and darker the more we learn about the residential school system, we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about that next episode with Maggie Wente. So Maggie Wente is not only an ILT member. I'm saying that like that's the most important thing when it's not. Maggie's also a partner at OKT and a member of the Serpent River First Nation. So Maggie has a broad practice serving First Nations governments, their related entities, businesses, and not-for-profit organizations. Maggie advises on treaty and Aboriginal rights and litigation and negotiations, human rights of Indigenous people, and in particular, equality for First Nation children and individuals in programs and services, in particular in the child welfare system. So big resource there. Going to share some places for us to start, some places that we can write to, learn from, donate to, and how, I guess our role is just how to help you make it habit. So we have to keep talking about it too. It can't just be this month. These things that we learned this month, whether it's over Pride, whether it is over our history here in Canada, we need to continue to strive to learn and evolve so that we can have deeper connections with people around us. One of our values here at Iron Lion Training is building strong relationships. And that's how we help people reach their fitness goals, is by helping them build better relationships with their body, with nutrition, with exercise, and just with the world around them through different perspectives and different worldviews. So that's a lot. And we're prepping for reopening, but that's a whole other thing, and I'm not going to put that out there. Thanks again, Z's. We love you, and we love those who are listening. If you learned anything from this, let us know. Send us a message. You can send us an email. You can send us a DM. Yeah, just be respectful. Just be respectful. Send us a DM. Ask us your questions. If you want to hear us talk about other things, we do have our resident expert, Helen, who is a PhD and knows a lot of stuff. We usually, when we don't know stuff, we usually ask Helen. She usually knows the answer. So yeah, and we also have our program director, Ron, who knows a lot about programming, exercises. He's shaking his head in the background as he's working. But yes, we're not the smartest, but we know a lot of smart people, and we hope you keep listening. Let us know what you want to learn from us. And this is where I throw and I say our catch line, which is eat pizza. No?
Yeah.
All right. It's find your power in the pride. Hashtag find your power in the pride. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being a part of what we do. And we will talk more on fitness junk debunked later this week. Bye for now.